Back in 2012, the Today Show did a survey of 7,000 moms across the U.S., and they discovered that the average stress level of a mother is 8.5 out of 10. Can any mothers out there identify with that? Would it be more like 11 out of 10? Moreover, they discovered 1 in 4 mothers said that the pressure they put on themselves to be perfect is a top cause of the stress. For example, one mom writes that she tends to project 20 years ahead with every little parenting decision. If she lets her daughter have an extra cookie or lets her son quit karate, how will that affect their development into mature, responsible adults? Still, a mother says this. She says, we worry about what our kids eat, how they will behave, whether they study enough, socialize normally, and live healthfully. And while we're at it, we worry about ourselves and whether we're good enough at home, work, and our kids' school and everywhere. And on top of that, we worry about what others think of us. Oh, and we also worry about being too worried. This said, what do Jesus' words from our gospel reading this morning have to say to worried and exhausted mothers? Does it have any impact at their point of need? Or think about your own life. How might Jesus' invitation to rest speak into your everyday exhaustion? Maybe you're in high school or college and the stress of achievement and the unknown of the future is causing you to have anxiety attacks. Maybe you're taking care of an aging parent and you're just downright exhausted. Maybe work is forcing you to choose between your family and success. Whatever the case, how might Jesus' words speak to your point of need? Well, let's set the context. Our passage comes right on the heels of Jesus pronouncing judgment on the cities where he performed the most mighty of miracles. For example, he says, you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. Along with this, immediately following our reading today, Jesus has a series of run-ins with the religious authorities where they publicly conclude that Jesus is working with Satan to perform his miracles and exorcisms. So sandwiched between these two dramatic displays of unbelief is Jesus' invitation to belief. I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, he prays, that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and have revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for such is your gracious will. At first, this is a strange prayer. It appears as though Jesus is thanking God for hiding the gospel from people. Well, what Jesus is actually praising God for here is that the way to knowing him is not through human achievement, excellence, or wisdom. Rather, in the gospel, God has revealed himself to us in such a way that it can only be received through simple trust. And this is so much the case that in the Greek, Jesus says that literal babies like Joseph can receive it. The rub with the wise, understanding, and even religious is that this kind of simple trust does not come easily. And we see this dynamic played out before our eyes in the next chapter of Matthew. Rather than simply receiving Jesus' person and work and message, the religious authorities grimace every step of the way. So continuing, Jesus declares, all things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. So this verse forms the backbone of why we can both exhibit simple trust in Jesus and also come to him for rest. First, Jesus is in possession of all things divine. He has all authority, all power, and all knowledge. Therefore, he is worthy and can handle us coming to him in simple trust. Second, knowledge of God can only be found in Jesus. Only by knowing Jesus, God the Son, can we know God the Father, and only by knowing God the Father can we know Jesus, God the Son. Therefore, trying to know God or find salvation through our own wisdom and knowledge and religion is just about as effective as clinging to straws when we're drowning. We surely won't be saved, and we will exhaust ourselves to death trying to do so. So it's here that we come to Jesus' gracious offer of rest that is rooted in who he is and what he is doing. Because Jesus has been given all things to him by the Father and is the only way to knowledge of God and salvation, we can, as mere babies, trust and come to him for rest. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Few words have ever been spoken that invoke such comfort as these. In his full authority as God the Son, Jesus kindly calls out the fatigued, burdened, and poor sinners who are weighed down to earth with their transgressions and guilt, unable to find solace and relief. Now, what this rest and refreshment is becomes clear when Jesus continues saying, "Take my yoke upon you, learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." In Jesus' day, a yoke was simply the literal cross piece that was fastened over the necks of two animals to the task of clearing large loads or plowing. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound too restful to me. Well, also in Jesus' day, a yoke referred to being under authority, bondage, or some kind of teaching. So in the case of our passage, the people of Israel were under the heavy yoke of the religious authorities. So, for example, later in Matthew, Jesus says they, the religious leaders, tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move their finger. So in contrast to this, Jesus says his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Why? Well, it's because of the kind of person he is at the core of his being: gentle, meek, lowly in heart, and humble. He came to save us sinners from burdens that we cannot carry, and he put them on his own shoulders. Another thing we discover from verse 29, that to take Jesus' yoke is to simply learn from him. As he said earlier, he is the only avenue to learning who God is and what his disposition to us is. Therefore, to learn from Jesus is to discover that God is for us to such an extent that he sent his Son to live the life we should have lived, die the death we should have died, and rise again. And this glorious message of God's grace for sinners doesn't burden, but rather it refreshes the soul. It gives us rest at the core of our being. We are free from the burden of sin, death, law, and the devil. We are free from searching for refreshment from other things. We are free to be who we are, sinners who are loved by God. So how does this then give us rest in the here and now? How does it speak to the exhausted parent, an anxious son or daughter, or an overworked secretary, or a person in the grips of depression? How does it give us rest at the point of our need? Well, for one thing, if you're currently experiencing restlessness, this passage forces you to ask, what gives? Why am I restless? The church father St. Augustine once made the following observation: God, you have formed us for yourself, and our hearts are restless till they find their rest in you. In other words, God has designed us to find our rest in him and him alone. Conversely, if we are restless, that means that we are searching for rest in something other than him. To put it in the language of our passage, it may be because we're carrying a yoke or a burden that isn't Jesus's. Maybe it's the yoke of our wants, our desires, our dreams, our hopes, our goals, expectations, or feelings. For example, that Today Show survey I talked about earlier, listen to what one mother said. She said this: The problem is not that we have problems, because every person has specific challenges. It's this idea that we are not supposed to have problems. We have this ideal family in our heads, and we spend all this time trying to get something that's not real. In other words, many moms, and really for many dads, I would argue, they're carrying a yoke of a desire for what they envision to be the perfect family. And in the end, this yoke smothers them with stress and anxiety. So how about you? Where are you restless right now? Where are you angry? Where do you feel anxiety, unease, impatience, and agitation? Why do you think it's there? Well, chances are part of it is you are currently carrying a yoke that isn't Jesus's. And if that's the case, Jesus is calling you to drop that heavy burden and come to him to take a new yoke that will give you refreshment and rest. Seek me first, he's saying, and I will take care of the rest. The good news is that Jesus never tires of giving us that invitation. Even right this very moment, he's coming in meekness and humility to save labored and burdened sinners like us. Once more in communion, he gives himself to us in the bread and wine so that we might find true rest and refreshment for our souls. I've quoted this before, but Martin Luther actually references our passage today when he describes communion in his large catechism. He says, in this sacrament, he offers us all the treasures he brought from heaven for us, to which he most graciously invites us in other places, as he says in Matthew 11, come to me, all who heavy labor and are heavy laden, and I will refresh you. And this is some of my favorite words here. He says, if therefore you are heavy laden and feel your weakness, then go joyfully to this sacrament and obtain refreshment, consolation, and strength. So this morning, if you feel restless, labored, and heavy laden, hear this good news. The one who has been given all things from God the Father and is the only way to know God comes to you in word and sacrament, offering and giving you rest and refreshment. He gives you a yoke that is simply the good news of all he has done on your behalf. Learn from him. He is gentle and humble in heart. More than this, in mere minutes, you can come to him in the bread and the wine, seeking to satisfy your parched soul. So if you feel the weight of your sin, your life, run to the altar this morning and find your rest. Let us pray. God, we thank you that you reveal yourself in such a way that mere babies can receive you. We thank you that we personally got to witness that in the baptism of Joseph this morning. And we thank you that we got to hear that in the words Jesus spoke. We ask that you give us faith and simple trust to believe and receive those things. And as we prepare to come to your altar this morning, help us thirst and long for the rest and refreshment that you give. We ask this in Jesus' name.